Some 2 months following the launch of Proton's new S70, we finally have the opportunity to take it out for a drive. So today in this video, we're going to figure out how this car feels like out on the open road, how it handles itself through some tight and twisty corners, and more importantly, if the new Proton S70 is now the C-segment saloon to beat, or if it's desperately outmatched by its very, very fervent competition. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our preview drive of the new Proton S70. Now, the Proton S70 is a C-segment saloon, so it technically competes against vehicles like the Toyota Corolla Altis as well as the Honda Civic. However, in terms of pricing, with prices starting under 80,000 ringgit, the S70 goes right up against B-segment saloon competitors instead, such as Honda's City and Toyota's Vios. Now, the thing about the S70 is that Proton's priority was to ensure there is an adequate amount of space for passengers as well as for luggage, and more importantly, to provide something that appeals to more traditionalist customers, which is why the design of the S70 is rather more traditional than what we might expect from the company. So from the side profile, you can tell that this car has a very typical traditional 3-box saloon look with a very pointed front end, a rather large central cabin, as well as a rather pert rear end. Now, in terms of the overall design aesthetic, I do think the S70 does look quite handsome. The front end especially ties in a lot of Proton design language very neatly, such as the ethereal bow, the new sort of songket weave grille with the diamond pins in order to signify this car's newest generation status, as well as the rather sharp LED headlights on either side, which even come with an animation function when you lock and unlock the car. Overall, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very handsome looking saloon, and that extends down to the side as well. This Premium X model that we have here, done in quartz black, rides on 17-inch alloy wheels with a dual tone design, and it's wrapped in Goodyear Triple Max 2 tires, which are a mid-range rubber, which is in keeping with this car's sort of mid-range status. Now, because it's the Premium X, it does come with a little bit of a body kit consisting of a front lip spoiler, some side skirts, a rear lip spoiler up here, as well as a rear diffuser element. But all of this ties into what is, again, as I mentioned several times now, a rather handsome looking car. If you were to ask me, there are a couple of issues I have with this. Firstly is the fact that the door lock and unlock button is done up in chrome, which on this quartz black car stands out like a sore thumb. And also, for some reason, this angle here just doesn't seem to jive with me. I'm not sure why, but maybe it could have been a bit longer. Now, at the back of the S70, most variants get this LED tail light bar, with only the most standard model getting a couple of separated tail lights. You get the Proton badge here, the S70 badge here, which also has the beveled edges that we first saw from the X90. And for this Premium X model, like I mentioned earlier, there is a little bit of a space down here, as well as this lovely boot spoiler. Now, the reason why the boot popped open without me prompting it is because there is actually a comfort access feature where if you stand by the boot long enough, it will open on its own. This is to make it a little bit more affordable as opposed to putting a kick sensor, and I actually find this a little bit more reliable. But when you do open the tailgate, you will find a pretty good amount of space. So now there's actually enough equipment in here for 3 journalists, which means this is much more crap than most people carry, and it's swallowing it up all quite easily. On top of that, you can fold the rear seat 60/40, and underneath the boot floor, there is a space saver spare wheel, unlike the Toyota Vios. Now, what I'd like to mention about the light bar is the fact that when you lock and unlock the car, it also has its own rather interesting animation. The only trouble is that most Malaysians like me reverse park their cars, which means you'll never see it. And the animation on the front is not nearly as exuberant as the one on the back, so a bit of a missed opportunity. Now, inside the S70, this certainly feels like a modern Proton, because up ahead you have this enormous head unit with an 8.3 aspect ratio, which makes it very wide and it's very crisp with really good graphics. Now, Proton has made it a point to mention that the graphics card as well as the operating card in here is now upgraded over the vehicles before it, which means it is now snappier and more responsive to use than any Proton before it, which is certainly appreciative because there are now more features in this than we've seen from other cars. Now, in addition to this screen, there is also a full digital heads-up display, or rather a full digital instrument cluster up here, which is exactly the same as the one that we saw from the Proton X90, which means, again, you have updated graphics, updated features. It is more in line with Proton's flagship versus vehicles like the X70 and the X50. Now, however, up ahead you will find the steering wheel from an X50, which means it's nice and chunky, you've got nice buttons here, everything falls very easily to hand, and this is all very sensibly and logically laid out. And of course you still have an indicator store, Tesla. You also have an X90 style gear selector here, which is now screaming at me because I moved it. There is a wireless charger here, there's a USB-A port, there's a little shelf here, there are a couple of cup holders, a nice decently sized center armrest, which is large enough for me to lose my arm in. You've got decently sized door bins, which I can't really demonstrate right now because the bottles they've given us are tiny. And you have a decently sized glove box in here, which is also big enough to hold the owner's manual and service book. Now, in terms of the overall comfort, the driver's seat in the higher end models are electrically adjustable, but the seats on the passenger side are manual no matter which variant you get. This being the flagship X, it also comes with the sunroof, which is open right now, so you can see me, but it is also unbearably hot. Now, mercifully, the PROTON S70 does come with climate control, although it is single zone. It does try to deceive you, however, because when you open the climate control screen, it shows two thermometers on either side, as if it has dual zone. But it doesn't. Mercifully, what it does have are a set of very strong blower motors, which means once the aircon is on, at least the cabin cools quite quickly, which is great because these leatherette seats are not ventilated at all. In the back of the S70, with this seat set up in my driving position, as you can see, I have a good amount of kneeroom and a good amount of headroom. And of course, I get USB-A and USB-C ports, a couple of aircon blowers back here as well, decently sized door pockets, large enough to fit a water bottle, and I also get a central armrest with a couple more cup holders. So overall, accoutrements at the rear are pretty good. Now, because this doesn't quite have the same sort of sloping roofline that you get from the Honda Civic, it does mean that headroom improves quite dramatically. And even though the interior accommodations, if you ask me, are about on par with what you get from the larger B-segment saloons vehicles instead of C-segment saloons, as far as I'm concerned, I think life back here is really not that bad. A couple of things I do appreciate are things like the fact that the seat base is relatively long, which means if I stretch my feet out underneath the seat in front of me, which I can do because these seats are mounted quite high, I do have a decent amount of under-thigh support. And these rear headrests are individually adjustable, which means I can actually get to a very comfortable position should I so want to. Now, obviously, there are ISOFIX mounts on the left and right, which means you can put a child seat in here with a decent amount of ease, but be advised that if the front seats are set too far backwards, you might not be able to fit a bulky rear-facing child seat. However, these doors do open wide enough, which means even the largest child seats should be able to get in and out quite easily. Now, these are all things that we covered in the walk-around of the PROTON S70 during the preview, which was prior to the launch. However, since then, now that we've discovered how much this car costs, and more importantly, now that these cars can be registered, like this one has, the bigger question is, what is the S70 like to drive? We're here in Penang, so let's go find some nice twisty B roads. So taking on some of Penang's really beautiful B roads, kind of just past the Teluk Bahang, where the turns are nice and tight and technical, and mercifully today there isn't that much traffic, it reveals some of the S70's weaknesses. Now, the S70 is naturally powered by a 3-cylinder turbocharged petrol engine, the 1.5T according to Proton, producing 150 PS and 226 Newton meters of torque, with 0 to 100 completed in about 7 seconds-ish thereabouts, with power going to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox. So you'd think that on paper, this is a setup that is designed for a slightly more exhilarating drive. And to be fair, you wouldn't really be that wrong. We've sampled this engine before in the lower variants of the X50, and it seems perfectly capable. However, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of driving is where the S70 shows off its weaknesses, because through the turns, firstly, the most obvious thing you notice is the way this car is set up in terms of its ride and handling. So the ride in this car is very impressive in the sense that it's very well dampened. The damper rates are set up in such a way that your primary ride is pretty smooth, and secondary ride allows the car to settle down quite quickly. So it does give you some degree of confidence even when you're going through, say, a mid-corner undulation. It doesn't unsettle the car too much. But as you're trying to carry speed through corners, that's when you will begin to realize that this car's slightly softer suspension setup or spring rate means that there is quite a bit of body movement. Now, if you were to have this setup in, say, an X70 or an X50, you'd feel the body lean. But because this is a saloon, what you get instead is a little bit of rear end movement. So instead, the weight of the car is sort of pushing that body outwards, which means maintaining a line while driving, particularly spiritedly, can be a little bit more challenging than you might expect. Now, the Goodyear Triple Max Assurance tires may have something to do with this. Perhaps a slightly softer compound rubber, something with a little bit more performance, may be able to fix this to some degree. But it seems quite clear that the standard setup for the S70 is one that is not really made for truly enthusiastic driving. And that's okay. The slightly more annoying aspect for me, however, is in terms of the power delivery. Now, when you're driving a car like this, even if you're not driving it the most enthusiastically, and it starts screaming at you like that, you may have a few more demands in terms of power delivery, in terms of the immediacy of that power delivery. Now, based on our experience with this 1.5-litre turbocharged engine, we've found that the power delivery is a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more laid back than one might necessarily expect, which is fine on an X70, it's fine on an X90, it is a little bit irritating on an X50, but in this S70, I find it to be a little bit more intrusive. I say this because if you're allowing your mood to get the better of you, and so you start driving with a little bit more gusto, imagine you enter a corner with a degree of speed, you hit the brakes, slow the car down. The brakes in this car are pretty good, exactly what you'd expect from this segment. So you slow the car down, enter the corner, and as you're trying to exit, you put your foot down, and it takes about half a second before the car reacts. And this might not seem like much to you, and truly it really shouldn't. But for, again, the most spirited drivers, you are going to notice that the throttle input delay is kind of obvious. That and the ADAS systems that constantly scream at you as you go anywhere near a line. So what that means to me is that this is clearly not an enthusiast car. Compare this to, say, the Mazda 3 or even the Honda Civic. Those cars are more geared, they're better engineered and tuned towards people who drive for the sake of driving, for the joy of driving. This is not for that crowd. And that's perfectly okay, because the motorway is where the S70 truly shines. This car's ride and handling setup is clearly geared towards long distance and long-legged comfort, and the powertrain does that very well too. So I've been driving for about 2.5-3 hours from Ipoh. I'm now almost heading into Kuala Lumpur, and to be honest, being sat here, it feels like I'm in something that is a lot more sophisticated and, more importantly, a lot more expensive. This 1.5-litre engine is amazingly muted at speed, even north of the national speed limit, which you shouldn't do anyway, but that's what I've been doing in order to test. And in terms of road noise and vibrations and so on, again, because the suspension is very well judged, it soaks up the lumps and bumps very, very well indeed. The secondary ride allows the car to settle down very quickly. But more importantly, in terms of wind and road noise, at 110, 120 kilometers an hour, this car is impressively quiet. Even if you were to stray further than 120 kilometers an hour, which again, we do not recommend, it still remains very quiet and very plush and very muted, with the only exceptions being the occasional beep and bong to let you know that the vehicle in front has slowed down for no particular reason. So if you ask me, does this make the S70 a car worth looking at? Absolutely. The price difference between an S70 versus, say, a Toyota Corolla Altis or a Honda Civic is sizable enough that if you're looking for a C-segment saloon, you should take a look at the S70 first before making a decision, because you'd be amazed at just how close this car gets to some of the segment leaders. And compared to vehicles like the Honda City and Toyota Vios, when you're doing long drives like this, the turbocharged engine really does have its benefits, being able to run at a slightly lower RPM while maintaining very decent fuel economy, because despite maintaining a very high average cruising speed, we are now reporting 7.9 liters per 100 kilometers, which means this car is also incredibly efficient. But of course, if you're driving primarily in town compared to B-segment vehicles, then of course the Toyota Vios and the Honda City will most likely be the more affordable options to run day to day, particularly the Honda City Hybrid. But if you want a car that is a bit more capable at doing a little bit of everything, be it urban driving or long distance cruising like I've been able to test over the last couple of days, then the S70 really does put Proton's best foot forward. This is a very, very impressive car from Proton, more so for the price. The only question now is, am I going to finally get Android Auto? In any case, that has been our preview drive of the 2024 Proton S70. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.